Thank you. Our next speaker is Stephen Pringle. And Stephen is a long-term friend of the African Bird Club and was our treasurer for a couple of years. He was born in Cheshire, but quite early on in his life was lucky enough to study in Cape Town, which is where I think he got his love of African wildlife and African birds from. He said that he almost went into zoology at that stage, but the head ruled the heart, and he instead studied mathematics and physics, going on to then have fellowships with a couple of UK universities, and then form his own company based around automation and electronics. However, clearly the love of wildlife didn't go away. Back about 3 or 4 years ago, he decided to return to a more biological study and undertook an MSc in conservation biology at DICE in Kent. It was during that time when he undertook a study with colleagues from the universities of Leeds and Bulawayo into the impacts of land transformation in Zimbabwe on bird populations there. And that's going to be the subject of his talk this morning. Thank you, Stephen.
No problem. No problem. Right, good morning everyone, and thank you for a nice introduction, Paul. The morning started off so well, something just had to go wrong. We got the train on time, we got the underground on time, we zoomed in through the side entrance. I loaded the dreaded memory stick and found that I loaded the first slide and the rest was corrupted. But I'm still smiling because Paul said, have you got anything else? And on the same stick, I had another presentation, which I gave a few weeks ago, on another topic on African birds, which is also relevant. And Paul's kindly suggested that I do that one instead because of the relevance to this audience. And it's a very topical subject. I bet almost everyone here today has a mobile phone. And those of you who've traveled in developing countries in recent years will have noticed that mobile phones are everywhere. Developing countries have sort of jumped beyond many barriers in technology straight into mobile phones and often into 4G phones, some of which are cleverly disguised like this. And I've been involved in a couple of studies. The most obvious thing is to look at the threat to birds in the way that people were worried about phones by the head and cancer and so on. I haven't been involved in that. Obviously, these towers are putting out 100 watts, and birds that are sitting there, nesting there, are exposed to that all the time. But what's also interesting is the potential behavioral effects of the fact that these masts have replaced the traditional wired systems throughout many parts of Africa. And in treeless parts, it's a particular change because these wired systems are increasingly being dismantled. Birds over the last 100 years have got used to roosting on them, and now they don't have that facility. It has caused behavioral changes that I've worked on and published a paper last week in this journal, which is the Journal for Gullible Ornithologists. And the phenomenon is that the birds no longer have the wires to perch on. What it's causing is new forms of death and injury because of this phenomenon. When the power fails, that's what happens. Anyway, sorry to give you an April Fool's joke. I thought I couldn't resist with a captive audience. The only bad aspect is that I've completely destroyed my credibility. Genuinely, I have a proper talk. It's not a problem. I do have the talk I was going to give, and this is dead serious. It is not actually the dissertation that I did within my MSc. It's a project that I did within the MSc. In fact, it was a relatively small part, but I spent an awful lot of time on it because it particularly interested me. And it's of great interest from various points of view, conservation, but also the fact that it involves work on counts. And I would think almost everyone here today has done a bird count of some sort at some time. The background, another cartoon, but this is serious. Back in 1994, this rather serious cartoon appeared in a Seattle newspaper. As you can see, it shows a train going up an ever-increasing railway slope, which is a track laid on the human population of the world. And at that point, it was thought that there'd be 15 billion people in the world by 2075. And the train is pulling two carriages, which is talking about food systems and delivery. And really, those were seen as the big challenges. How do you feed all the people in the world, and how do you deliver the food to the people? Well, 6 years later, there was a bit of good news in that the population was seen to be plateauing at 10 billion people, rather than 15. And we were sitting at just over 6 billion then. Well, you can go on the internet today and find out how many there were yesterday, and we're at about 7.4 billion people today. So the good news is that we're pretty much on that curve, but you need to bear in mind that if we do reach this, this 10 billion by 2100, then that's an extra 2,500 million people, which is 40 times the population of Britain. So there's quite a challenge in how to provide food for everyone, and this has kept a lot of ecologists rather busy over the last few years, in particular one of the people being Ben Phelan, who was mentioned in Lincoln's talk. Ben wrote one of the early papers on this concept of effectively, if ecologists and conservationists could rule the world, how would they go about feeding the extra 2.5 billion people? And they came up with two models, really, two extreme models. If you take the top series of photographs, in an idealized world, there's intensive agriculture on the right, nature-friendly agriculture in the middle, and sort of natural habitat on the left. If you want to ramp up food production very considerably, one of the options is to reduce nature-friendly farming, which is relatively inefficient, ramp up industrialized farming, and by doing so, you could, in principle, save any of the natural habitat from further transformation into farmland. And the other model is to go the other way and reduce industrialized farming, increase green farming, as it were, but that being much less efficient, you would have to take some of the natural habitat. So the talk today is, the reason the project was done was that it provides a little bit of information about what happens if you transform natural habitat into low-level, in this case, subsistence farming in an African context. And specifically, it happens to be in Zimbabwe. I'm sure many of you have been there. It's a landlocked country in the southern third of Africa. It's actually relatively rich in birds, 670 species, but it's not terribly exciting for twitchers and listers because there are no endemic birds there. So this is not a talk about endangered birds or special birds, it's a talk about very common birds in the African savanna and what happens to them when you change the land use type. The reason that it's set in Zimbabwe is that there was a unique opportunity there brought about by the fast-track reform program, land reform program that the government there brought in the year 2000. And as a result of that, in the next 7 years, 8 million hectares were resettled. And a lot of subsistence farming is now done on areas that were formerly not farmed. And there are potential consequences for biodiversity. And the person who spotted the opportunity to do a study there, because of his considerable knowledge of working on birds in southern Africa, in particular on Quelea with Bob Cheek, who's here somewhere, and he later worked a lot in Saint-Thomé and Principe. He was an African Bird Club member. Martin Dallema, who's at the University of Leeds, who's since moved on to other areas of research. He remains interested in birds, but he spotted the opportunity to look at what happens to the birds in a land use change scenario. And she knew of two other top ornithologists in Zimbabwe, Ngoni Chiweshi, who is a top field ornithologist, and Peter Mundy, who I think many of you will know from his vulture and quelea work, both based in Bulawayo. The three of them got their heads together and identified a project which was basically to assess the impact of land use change on bird diversity and abundance. And they identified a site. So the site is this former 91,000 hectare ranch, which was called Debshan, which was wholly owned by the De Beers group of companies, and Debshan stood for De Beers Shangani. And they had had that large site and used it for game ranching and cattle ranching for many, many years. So it was a sort of nature reserve, but with some ranching on it. Martin applied to the Rufford Foundation back in 2011, I suppose, and received a grant that enabled him and Ngoni Chiweshi to do 2 lots of field work in winter, so June there being winter 2012 and summer 2013, to catch the resident birds and the migrants. So the ranch itself, shown schematically here, comprised a total of 91,000 hectares. And in this agreement between De Beers and the Zimbabwe government, the grey area was ceded to local people to set up subsistence farmland on what had previously been one contiguous area of ranch. So the orange or yellow bit there remained under the ownership and control of the Debshan game ranching part of De Beers. So the idea is that the yellowish area remained unspoiled, as it were, and the grey area over a 10-year period was transformed from that unspoiled area to that plus subsistence farming. And all of these spots are the study sites where the surveys were done. There are 3 types of habitat there. So there is acacia woodland, miombo woodland, and open grassland with a few scattered trees and bushes. This is a winter view. In winter, it's very dry there. In summer, after the summer rains, it's relatively green and lush. And if you look at the rainfall, this is over a 20-year period, relatively consistent. It's about 750 millimeters a year, which is a bit like southern England. So they receive a fair amount of rain, but it is very sharply peaked in the summer months, and in winter it is extremely dry and rather cold as well. In the course of their transect counts that they did, they also recorded quite a number of other features of the sites just to get some sort of background on the sites. So they surveyed 23 sites in the farmed areas, the newly resettled areas, and 22 in the unfarmed game ranched areas. And they recorded the number of people they happened to see. This is not the total number of people, but this is the number they saw during the counts. So roughly 10 times as many people seen in the farm sites and 25 times as many homesteads. This is more than just houses, homesteads. They saw 64 dogs versus 1, and roughly the same number of cattle in both areas. They also recorded cut trees. Well, there is no power on this site at all, or certainly not in the resettled area. So the only source of power for cooking and heating is by using firewood. So it's hardly surprising that in 21 of the farm sites, they recorded cut trees, and they saw that only in 1 of the ranch sites. Standing water, slightly more in the farm sites. Crops, entirely in the farm sites. And the crops themselves, you may identify quite a few of them, but maize, sugar beans, these are things called run nuts, various gourds. These are ground nuts, or peanuts, in other words. And this is finger millet. So 6 types of crop grown there. They also, and this was not optimized for mammals, they also recorded the mammals they happened to see during the bird counts. So they saw far more in the ranch sites than they did in the farm sites. So steenbuck, reedbuck, impala, tsessebe, zebra, kudu, eland, and waterbuck all present in the ranch sites and very far fewer in the farm sites. And some small mammals, again, far fewer in the farm sites, black-backed jackal, the vervet monkey, and the warthog. So it's not looking great for the mammals, but it's not optimized for this sort of counting. Right, the transects themselves, they identified the 3 different types of habitat, and they then placed transects randomly within each habitat and land use type, and they defined the transects by GPS coordinates. This is a winter's morning. Oops, what am I doing? They took with them binoculars, a notebook, a laser rangefinder, and a GPS. They did, in winter, they did 45 transects across the habitats and land use. Each transect just over 1 kilometer, but it took 2 hours because it's a very slow process doing this type of counting, and they counted at dawn and dusk. And they repeated the whole lot in summer 2013. If you work it out, they walked 108 kilometers doing all of this. And one of the first things you need to do to check that you've surveyed the area well is to do a species accumulation curve, which is, so each of these spots is 1 count, and the more counts you do, the more species you have if you are doing it cumulatively. And what you need to do is to check that you've counted the area thoroughly enough that you've recorded all the species there. Well, you never quite get there, but the accumulation curve plateaus, and in the ranched areas, after 23 counts, they had recorded 136 species. Some very clever statisticians have spent most of their careers working on how you use that data and how you extend it to the actual number of species and how you work out the 95% error bar, et cetera, and that is what you get. So there's some software that is freely available called Estimates, and the projection is that there are 143 species in the ranched areas. If you do the same thing for the farmed areas, you get the yellow curve, which is higher and which is statistically very significantly different from the ranched areas. So first interesting conclusion is that if you dig up the savanna and put in subsistence farms, you get more species, and in this case, about 14% more. So looking at some birds, I meant to say the habitat photographs all from Ngoni and Martin. All of the bird photographs and the mammal photographs are from various African trips that I've done with my wife, and they're not all from Zimbabwe, but some of them are. So one of the species that occurred in the farmed areas but was not seen in the ranched areas was the common waxbill. And so those of you who know this bird will think, oh, that's a pretty good invasive species. It's been introduced into South America, the Caribbean. I saw it 6 weeks ago in New Caledonia. It's just all over the place, and it succeeds. So maybe not too surprising that that one has moved in. The village weaver, another one that's only in the farmed areas. Again, for some bizarre reason, if you look in Birds of Africa, this was introduced into the Caribbean, where it became successful as well. So very successful colonizing type birds. So you may not be too surprised about those. And what about these two? The violet-eared waxbill and the Namakwa dove, again, only found in the farmed areas. They weren't seen on the ranches. You might think, well, there's finger millet growing there. These are both grain-eating birds, largely, that go for small grain, so that's probably attracted them. But what about these two, which also only occurred in the farmed areas? So the red-headed weaver and the red-winged starling both eat a mixture of insects and fruit. They're commonly associated with mankind, but why they should appear only in the farm and not in the ranches, it's not obvious to me. Another two that were only in the farmed areas, the white-necked raven, very successful. It's really a mountain bird, but it's successful at sort of scavenging. It'll take invertebrates, vertebrates, scraps of food, whatever. And the black-headed heron also turned up only in the farmed areas. again, a predatory type of bird. It's actually a heron that's not as associated with water as most of the other herons in Africa. If you look the other way around, what occurred only on the ranches but not in the farmed areas? Now, the first one with the largest number of individuals was the helmeted guinea fowl. And I find that a little bit surprising because this, again, is a very successful bird. It's very attracted by maize and millet. Why it wasn't in the farmed areas is not entirely obvious. And then you see another one, the next most common bird that was not in the ranched areas was the Shelley's francolin, quite sort of patchily distributed around southern and central Africa. And then you start to think, well, maybe because these are rather nice birds to eat, perhaps these are hunted and they're not found in the farms for that reason. And you look at a few others that are not in the farms. Corey busted, again, you'd probably rationalize that that's a bird that requires a very large home range. It doesn't like disturbance, so maybe that was scared away from the farmed areas. Three-banded courser, not too obvious to me. Yellow-throated longclaw, I would have thought it might have benefited, but it didn't. Southern masked weaver, not found in the farmed areas. So although you can rationalize some of these, it's not entirely obvious. But I'll come on to some more detail, which will hopefully elucidate things better. So how were the transects done? Well, if you do a linear transect, shown schematically here, this is Ngoni, say, walking along with a laser rangefinder. He spots a bird at this point. He's standing there. He spots a bird out there. He measures the angle with the laser rangefinder from his transect and the distance with the laser. Walks on a bit and does the same there. And in the analysis of the data, I then used a little bit of simple trigonometry and worked out the blue lines, which is the distance from the transect, and those that are over 100 meters, you reject. So you count everything and then do the rejection later. So you count everything within the green stripe, or do you? The problem is that you can't count everything because you can't see everything. And this is what sort of explains the phenomenon. So what I've grouped here is the real data. There were about 7,000 records. The real data for the number of individuals counted of all large birds over 150 grams, so one representation would be the African wattled plover. You find that this is the distance from the transect. And at 100 meters, you see rather fewer than you see right on the transect. And it is broadly a decline the further you go away. And you realize that it's to do with how cryptic a bird is, what its behavior is, and so on. And that then becomes more obvious if you look at little birds. So the same thing here with all birds under 15 grams. And one example in the area is the green-winged Pytilia. Although it's a very colorful bird, it's extremely well camouflaged in this sort of habitat. And at 100 meters, you hardly see any of them. Now, it's not because they don't occur there, it's because you can't see them. A really good example is the scaly-fronted weaver. We didn't record any over 60 meters, and it's, again, not because they weren't further away. Whereas if you look at the lilac-breasted roller, one of the sort of beauties of that part of the world, they sit at the top of a bush, and you'll see just as many of them 100 meters away as you will 10 meters away. So this actually, this observation has led to effectively a career for a lot of people in a unit at the University of St Andrews who've worked on what they call a distance estimation and a package called the distance package for estimating population sizes. And they use the real count data and turn it on its head and work out a probability of detection. And from that, you can then work out absolute abundances. And this software is used widely in anything from counting antelopes if you're flying over the Serengeti to counting whales off a ship. So I've applied that to all of this data, and I've worked out absolute abundances. Oh, sorry, you make these assumptions, you randomly place the transects, your identification of measurements have to be accurate, You record the birds the first time you see them immediately, but not after that. You assume that you count everything that's right on the transect, which is pretty obvious. And you also do the count quickly enough. So during the 2-hour period, we've assumed that the population remains constant. And if you then work out the absolute abundances of birds per hectare in the 3 habitat types, so acacia, miombo, and open farmland. Green is the ranched area, the yellow is the farmed area, and you see that in each habitat type, birds are more abundant, if you group all species together, in the farmed areas there than they are in the ranches. And not only are they more so, but statistically it's extremely significant. So you think, that's because of this grain. You've got all these grain-eating birds swamping the area, and it's just dominated your statistics. So you look at the grain-eating birds, and hey, presto, that's absolutely right. You find that phenomenon. The grain-eating birds are very significantly more abundant in all 3 habitat types than they are in the ranched areas. But then you look at the fruit-eating birds. They're not growing fruit here. And you find the same thing for fruit-eating birds. And you look at insectivores, and you find the same thing for them. And you look at omnivores, which is the sort of catch-all, and you find it's the same, with one exception, which is in the acacia, the trend is reversed. So you think, if you're Chris Megan, you think, right, let's spend all our conservation money digging up the savannah, we'll get more species, more abundance, and it doesn't harm anything. But don't do that just yet. Right. Along the way, obviously, they were counting birds of prey as well. I should say that the count system is not optimized for birds of prey. It's definitely not optimized for vultures, which do not tend to fly at dawn and dusk. And along the way, they saw 42 birds of prey of 10 species in the ranches and 25 or 12 species in the farmland. So you might say, and these were 3 of the species, you might say, well, looks as though birds of prey have suffered. And that's quite possibly true. The statistics, though, are very poor, and you certainly couldn't make a valid statistical case for it. If you then look at individual species where the abundance was over 60 individuals counted, which is generally a sort of rule of thumb for this sort of analysis, then what I plotted here is the abundance on the farmed areas divided by the abundance on the ranched areas, and all the bars on the right-hand side of the axis in blue are species which are more abundant in the farmland. All of these in red are the ones that are less abundant in the farmland, and the green ones are statistically the same. So effectively, these are the losers from land use change, and these are the winners. I won't go through all of them, but if you look at some of them, first of all, look at the ones where there was no change, regardless of the land use change. The abundance of the southern yellow-billed hornbill, crowned lapwing, red-faced mousebird, and white-browed sparrow weaver all stayed the same. I can't really comment. I'm slightly surprised that the hornbill didn't go down, but not sure. Look at the winners. In no particular, well, about Cape Starling, about 40% more abundant in the farmed areas. Again, it's a very successful bird in habitat that's been disturbed by man. Common bulbul, again, really quite successful in sort of man-dominated environments. African pipit is a winner. The emerald spotted wood dove slightly surprises me because it's a fairly solitary, shyish bird. Why that one is, I don't know, 60% more abundant in farmland, I'm not sure. African grey hornbill is a winner, more than 100% increase in abundance. I'm very surprised by that one. Blue waxbill, you'd say, oh, well, that's a grain eater, that would love the millis, that would be a big winner, as would the southern red bishop, probably. If you look at the losers, the top loser is the Swainson's spurfowl, which, again, if you look at birds of Africa, it talks about how that adapts well to man-modified habitats. So slightly surprised, but maybe it's this sort of vague theory that it's hunting that is the problem. Then the white helmet shrike, a sort of woodland bird, a cooperative breeder, insectivore. That's a loser. Maybe that's to do with firewood collection and a change of habitat. Two Palearctic migrants are losers, so our own barn swallow and the European bee eater. This one surprises me, the ring-necked dove, incredibly common in man-dominated habitats in southern Africa. That one has lost out. The grey go-away bird, you might think, well, maybe it's a bit too, it's a gregarious type of bird, maybe it's been scared off. The rufous-naped lark is a loser as well. So it's very hard to understand, looking at species by species, why these changes have taken place. The most interesting thing I then did was to actually group species by their average body mass. And again, the blue bars are losers, the red winners, the red bars are losers. So if you group species by mass, so this is all the birds under 10 grams, they were, I don't know, 170% more abundant, and so on up to here. Everything between 100 and 150 grams was, whatever that is, 75% more abundant. And all of the bigger birds were losers. So the pattern seems to be, not for every species, but if you group them in mass ranges, that it's the big birds that are losers and it's the small birds that are the winners. And if I'd been giving this talk 10 years ago, that's probably where I would have stopped. Sadly, I'm carrying on a bit, but what's the research told us? Well, it's told us about how individual species abundances and richness change, but the views on ecology and how to rate conservation have sort of moved on in recent years, and conservation is generally now seen more as wanting to maintain biological diversity and effectively do so by measuring traits and conserving traits of birds or animals in all senses, rather than species. So I want to do, the final part of the talk is actually analyzing the same data, but in a rather different way, and I've called it sort of looking beyond the species level. And to explain what I mean, looking at some other birds that are in this area. Moriko flycatcher, I'm sure you'd all say that's a classic insectivore. Curry-Chinese thrush, another insectivore, and the third one, up the top left, the common scimitarbill, another insectivore. And if you look in the data in birds of Africa, you'd broadly be correct. The flycatcher, main foods, termites, caterpillars, ants, grasshoppers, but you'd also find that it eats small fruits, in particular of these trees. So it is a seed disperser for these two common trees in that area. To just call it an insectivore is rather misleading. The Curry-Chinese thrush, in addition to various insects, is eating worms, mollusks, and lizards, and also seeds and fruits. And it's broadly similar, in addition, ant eggs and tree seeds for the scimitarbill. How about this one, this lovely bird, the amethyst sunbird, photographed here in the Zambezi Valley, apparently eating nectar, as you'd expect it to. But in birds of Africa, you'll find that it eats a large number of spiders, aphids, termites, and flies. Barbets, the black-colored barbet, mainly a fruit eater, but here one is eating an ant. These two predominantly fruit-eating birds are very different from each other. So the violet-backed starling, mainly a berry eater, mayor's parrot, more of a hard seed pod eater. And some of the seeds it eats need to be cracked open by this species in order for the seeds to be released to propagate. These ideas of looking at traits are not actually new. Old Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor in 1200, had the similar ideas that actually Aristotle's view on species was wrong, and that actually things should be grouped by their characters and what you would now call traits. So, and the field of sort of examining traits and the diversity of traits and distribution of traits in a community is now known as sort of functional diversity studies. And the big breakthrough in this field sort of has come about in the last 15 years, in particular from two papers from Owen Petchey and Kevin Gaston at the University of Sheffield, who developed a methodology and the framework for studying changes in functional diversity. So what does it measure? It measures the distribution of traits in a community. And by doing so, if we compare the traits that are present in the farmland birds and the traits that are present in the ranch area birds, we can work out what filtering, if any, has been done by the land use modification. So how do you calculate it? Well, it's a very simple concept, but it's not so easy to calculate it. What you have to do is to build up a database of all the traits, ideally, you can't get them all, of all of the species in the study area, and you do some rather clever, convoluted, complex maths to turn that not into a genetic relationship, as shown by Lincoln for the greenbills, but a trait relationship between all the species in the community. You combine that with the counts that you've done, which give the species abundances, and by working out the variation in abundances in conjunction with the traits that birds have, you can work out the functional diversity of the community. So basically what you do is you do this exercise once, it's a big job. You do these counts and you analyze them in terms of the land use type and end up with two different sets of indices for functional diversity and compare the one with the other to work out the effect of land use change. You get I got my the traits for the birds from the wonderful 7-volume Birds of Africa, which is an absolute mine of all of the traits of all of the birds of Africa. And in this case, I chose traits that define the resource use of the birds. And by that, I mean that I took 5 morphometric measurements defining the sort of shape and size and mass of the bird. I categorized bill shapes into 4 different types, and I categorized the foods into 6 different types and allowed birds to be members of several feeding guilds. So they could be a frugivore, a granivore, an insectivore, whatever, up to 6 different food types, giving a total of 15 traits. So what do you do with that? I'm trying to visualize this just in 2 dimensions. If you plot, say, the Morrico flycatcher, its body mass against its bill length, you get a spot there. It's sort of 24 grams and 13 millimeter bill. If you put this common scimitar bill on the same graph, you get it up there. And the distance between those 2 points, A, B, is the sort of trait separation of those 2 birds if you only look at those 2 traits. Put in another one, it's out there, another one over there. So each of these lines gives the distance between the birds mathematically in terms of those 2 traits. You then have to convert that into 15 dimensions and 179 species, which is a bit mind-boggling, and you end up, after a lot of computer usage, with a chart like this, which you can't possibly read, but if you zoom in and look at some of it, you get this relationship. So these are some of the species in the community. The linking lines actually show, in the same way that they'd be genetically close, here they have very similar traits. So if you consider all of these closely grouped species here, shown here, so all small, very colorful seed eaters, they're all occupying very similar niches within the community. And the green arrows show 5 of those species all increased greatly in abundance after the land was transformed into farms. And 2 of those species that are here are new arrivals into the farmed area. Now it turns out because they have basically the same traits as all of the other species that are already there, they're described rather funny, jokingly, or seriously, as functionally redundant, and they have added no new traits to the community. By contrast, the black-headed heron, which has turned up in the farm sites, is way out on its own in terms of its niche occupancy, and that has added some significant traits to the community. So I won't go through much more analysis, but what has this study of functional diversity shown? Well, it's shown that although the number of species in the farmed areas has increased by 14%, many of the new species are functionally redundant, which I find a funny phrase. It's a bit like in 2008, investment bankers were called socially useless. So these are functionally redundant birds. This analysis has also shown that the distribution of traits within the community and the occupancy of all these different niches has changed. And change in the indices has suggested that the farmed community, farmed areas may be more vulnerable now to invasive species. It hasn't, and by that I mean sort of house crows or common miners or whatever. It hasn't happened yet, or it hadn't happened by 2013. So going back to the original question, and I'm very nearly there, how have the birds fared in the farmed areas? Well, the answer is it really depends on how you analyze the data. If you look just at the bird species, the richness has increased. Most of the small species have increased in abundance, but the larger ones have declined. If you look at the population in the two areas, the farmed areas now host a larger bird population. They're more abundant there. There are more abundances if you just use a primary food type of frugivores, granivores, and insectivores. But most of the larger birds are in decline, and perhaps the raptors are in decline. If you look with this sort of new definition of considering the traits in the community, how are the birds contributing? Well, many of the new birds are functionally redundant, and perhaps the land use change has opened up the possibility of invasive species. So I will end with something that became crystal clear to me doing the master's course that I did, that there are many, many different views on conservation. It's actually a very interesting science that is also very subjective, and it depends on the viewpoint from which you come. This quote I've put here, which is from a paper by Georgina Mace, who is an academic close to here at Imperial College, I thought summed it up very well. She said that all conservation judgments are value judgments, and the values involved are human values, not properties of the organisms involved. So I'll finish that and thank Martin Dalamer and Ngoni Chiweshi did all of the field work. Peter Mundy was basically a consultant to the project. There was a grant from Rufford Foundation supported the work, and De Beers were very supportive, and so were the resettled farmers who gave their permission for the work to be carried out on their land. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Just got time for a couple of very quick questions. If there's anything that's a really interesting look at something that's obviously, very widespread across, well, I think the whole world, but particularly the African continent.
Okay, thank you.
No questions on mobile phones.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I just wanted to ask whether you noticed that, just here behind Keith, you noticed whether, or you did any research in other areas that had undergone the transformation much longer time ago, to see whether the same diversity of species, for example, is found in areas that have been farmed for longer.
I nearly put something in at the beginning of the talk, but I realized I was going to overrun anyway. It's hard to find anything really comparable, but two papers do spring to mind. One, Professor Tony Sinclair, based in Canada, has done a huge amount of work in the Serengeti, mostly on mammals, and he's published a couple of papers that indicate that the birds in areas adjacent to the Serengeti, which have been turned into equivalent sorts of community farmland, but many years ago, so a longer period, have been not quite decimated, but greatly reduced in numbers. I have to say, I'm rather critical of the way the work was done, because it was done by doing counts on the back of a moving Land Rover going at 30 kilometers an hour, stopping every now and then. So I don't think it's a good example. Another example, though, which is rather more, I think, scientifically valid and was done much more recently, in southern Ethiopia, I think it is a mountainous part of Ethiopia, looked at bird abundance and species richness in similar situations where parts of the forest had been transformed into multi-crop environments. And they found quite a positive effect. They found some increased species, and a couple of the feeding guilds had actually increased in numbers. So I found evidence that it aided things and evidence that it destroyed things. And I think the answer is it really depends how long it goes on for. And I think the big worry here is, for obvious reasons, the local people have to use the firewood. And if they carry on chopping down all the trees, that really is going to transform things.
Thank you. Just one final question. Yeah.
I take it agrochemical use is really quite low in the region.
I think it's non-existent. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen.